Hi, thank you for coming to our workshop, the soil restoration and erosion. I'd like to say thank you to the generosity of Sonoma Master Gardener and a great deal of appreciation to Doug Kent's book on firescaping and California Native Plant Society's Fire Recovery Guide. I've used it liberally throughout this whole presentation. Also, we'd like to hold the questions and ask you to use the chat. It's being monitored throughout our presentation, and we'll take care of the questions and hopefully answers at the other end of the presentation. So as we begin, does nature really need our help? That's what the point of this presentation is. The help we give nature is in developing an overall plan with stages and priorities while addressing soil erosion. We want to understand what's needed by prioritizing the needs on our property. The goal today is in recognizing the importance of soil porosity, the porousness, and the role that roots play in soil erosion. Briefly, we'll talk a little bit about hydrophobic soil, especially after campfire. Then the effects of water on the soil, and again, the role that roots play on slopes. And finally, we'll finish up with winds and mulches that guard against the loss of soil. So to understand erosion, we start with the basic components of what soil is. Soil is alive. Soil does regenerate over time with attention. In a moment, we'll watch a short video on soil erosion, but let's set the stage first. On this circle graph, the components of soil, our focus is on the 5% of what organic matter is made up of. So you can see it on the blue area of the circle graph. And that's made up of organisms that are alive and roots and humus, which is well decomposed soil matter. And some scientists call that the battery of the soil. When soil is bare, like after a fire, raindrops can hit at 130 miles per hour. And the point of sharing this is that it dislodges the particles of the soil, which is on part of the topsoil. So we're going to go into depth on soil horizons. When a fire occurs, as you can see on the top of this slide, fire eliminates the canopy of the trees, and the duff of that leaf litter is affected, which then affects that 5% of the organic matter, burns it off. The soil erosion is the top layer of the soil that contains the minerals and the organic parts. The O is for the dead and the dying that break down and go into the lower. And you don't see it here, but the next level in our valley is what's called alluviation, which is sand, silt without the minerals that occur here. Not all areas have it. And the B section is the subsoil that has the minerals and the nutrients, but much fewer or less of the organics. And then the C part is the parent rock, and that's what, works its way up to the top. So just so you know about this, if you don't already, there is a soil pyramid that you can look up on YouTube, and they go into great detail about how to assess what your soil is and what the combinations are. So I provided the URL, but the point of it here is understanding, once again, those air pockets and the porosity of the size of the soil. The loam mix is of the organics and the clay with the silt that feeds the roots of the plant and the trees. So let's take about 2 minutes and play a video so that you can see what soil erosion is from one point. So there's a lot packed into that little video. So now we're going to go over on some details. I've shared this acronym. It talks about the different parts of what affects soil erosion. This is how this horizon slide was made, that we saw all those layers coming down. When we look at this picture, we see the images with different types of slopes, the waterways, the light, the heat, the rain and soil type, you know, from desert to the semi-arid. Note the different types of terrain, the scrub, the forest, the litter under the trees, that topsoil, the factors of climate and microbial matter. Soil takes eons to renew. With the fungi and the bacteria in the soil, that let's prevent the soil erosion while we can, for those roots and bugs to get the nutrition that they need in order to feed the plants. We're going to learn more about that in other workshops that are available. Porosity factors, as you can see on this slide, the dense, the clay, it moves over to the sand, the larger particles. This is what porosity is about. The clay soils are least erodible, but faster to produce runoff due to poor filtration, and they wash away the fine particles into the streams, which creates siltration in the streams. So the areas that have more space are the sand and gravel, but they're most erodible because they don't travel like clay, but they do have the air pockets. Particle size and experiments you can do with your own soil. The particles of the sand, the silt, and the clay, it's easy for water and nutrients to get to the roots of the plants. So as you can see on that slide, sand takes hours to drain through, whereas in silt, it takes days, and in clay, it can take years. So you can practice and experiment yourself on putting in soil in jars and watch the difference of how long it takes to come down. So now we're starting to address the more in-depth factors of soil erosion, how to prevent soil erosion, and creating that overall plan and itemizing out what makes your focus. Native Plant Society recommends minimizing foot traffic, equipment, and disturbance on burned landscapes because the erosion weakens the soil bonds, and that's how they're held together. Dislodging soil particles, you want to minimize that. Remember that rain that splashes out? Trampling, we don't want to trample the new seedlings that are beginning to sprout. And in reducing the compaction of the soil, because when it squishes together, it reduces that ability for the water to absorb, and it increases the likelihood that it's going to run off. Now we're going to transition to specifics following fire. A major factor in soil erosion is hydrophobic soil. If this applies to your property, we'll spend a few minutes covering the highlights. It is well worth watching a video on the next tiny URL. It's a YouTube video on gas and how the gas, when you burn the plants, there's a gas that's emitted, and that gas is what goes into the soil, especially at high fire temperatures like we had with campfire. That gas penetrates into the particles, those porousness in the soil itself, and it creates kind of a waxy substance that when it cools, it creates a cover across the top of the soil, and it makes penetration for the water, they call it infiltration, difficult, if at all, the water getting into the soil. And that also means the same coming back up, that the seeds are then prevented from germinating because they're not getting watered. It increases the surface runoff as well as the debris flow. So I will highlight a point on slopes about hydrophobic soil when we get to the slopes issue. I just want to make sure that I've covered all the areas. The larger size of the soil matter, whether it's sand or silt. If there's larger, there's more to be able to have that gas be able to penetrate it. So it typically will cover a layer and goes down from 1 to 6 inches, but predominantly it's the first 2 inches that you want to pay attention to, because oftentimes it doesn't go that deep. But you want to go around different parts of your property to test whether or not the hydrophobic effect is there. And why is that important? It's reduced amount of water infiltrating the soil. The rain hits and quickly runs off. Erosion is increased with greater amounts of runoff, and the fertile topsoil is lost. With this increased runoff, there's large amounts of sediment, and they clog the stream channels, and the quality of the water is reduced. You know, like when you see after a rainstorm, you'll see the water, the color is brown. That's all that soil that's getting kicked around. How to test for hydrophobic effects on your soil is to scrape away the ash, expose the mineral soil surface, place a drop of water on the dry soil, and wait about a minute. If it beads, it's hydrophobic. You want to repeat that several times, because remember, we're going down deeper, and you want to repeat that test until it no longer beads, and then you've reached your depth. But we're also suggesting to you that you do this on different parts of your property to see. It may be 1 inch in some areas and 2.5 inches in other areas. So the hope is getting water to the roots for the plant. The roots are actually what helps the hydrophobic layer break up. And so again, being able to do different kinds of things to be able to help that effect. The treatment interventions initially is light watering and using grass rakes or hose, stirrup hose, lightly dragged across the soil to break it up. You can also place logs and fallen trees across the slopes to prevent the runoff and to slow down that sediment from getting to the streams. On gentle slopes or level areas, you can rake and hoe a few inches off that top of the soil to break up that water repellent layer, allowing the water to infiltrate the soil for seed germination and root growth. The hula hoe, also known as the stirrup hose, are lightly dragged across the top of the soil. On gentle to steep slopes, scatter straw mulch to protect the soils from erosion. If possible, anchor that straw down and keep it in place. Remember, soil structure does regenerate, albeit slowly, as we saw in the film, and the goal is to increase and encourage the migration of microorganisms and roots getting their nutrition and hydration. Remember, the overall plan is to prioritize testing, assess for the presence of repellency. Now, moving away from the hydrophobic soil, let's look at the 6 factors to take into account the assessment of topsoil loss. There's very specific factors here. I want to give you a chance to be able to read it. And as we know, the severity of our fire with campfire was so bad. So in moving along, the neighborhood, how does the water move around your property, but those properties around you? If you're on slopes, you want to look up and see how the water is flowing. Look for the branches and the sediment, any clogged drainage and ditches and the culverts. Develop a plan with your neighbors, preventing the sediment and the debris from washing into the sensitive creeks. Now we move into recommended specifics on stopping soil erosion and promote soil restoration. Here we look at how water flows after a fire. We have interventions on topsoil loss, water effects on following the fire and water. There's 4 monitoring stormwater runoffs is to slow the spread, slow it, spread it out, sink it, and store it. Drain rainwater on the roads. I was so surprised. I didn't know. I know that we want to put sandbags around, but it's important that we keep these drains clear, as it is the leading cause of erosion. Divert the sheeting water. We are looking at the cascading water here. The topsoil loss is dramatic. Divert the runoff away from the landscape and towards the storm drain system. Check the drainage systems are clear. Slow down that velocity or the volume of the runoff at the culverts and the drain outlets. Slow down or break up large volumes of runoff. Prevent the soil erosion. Here are some temporary recommendations to slow the force of the water. Runoff diversions. These bales can be made up of oat, barley, wheat, or rice. These are a short-term remedy. Check those dams. The boards are staked perpendicular to the flow and they slow down the runoff. You need to keep the uphill side clean. Reduce the pressure because it'll increase the longevity of how these work. On diversion ditches, they can be 6 inches to 1.5 feet deep and 1.5 to 3 feet wide. Slowing the water from channeling on slopes. You want all the water to dissipate across the soil. So you want these wattles to be properly placed and installed. Slowing down the velocity, they call it velocity dissipators for the runoff, limiting erosion and sediment. So you have dry stacked walls that divert and depower the runoff, running mostly perpendicular to the slope or the water path. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about slopes. These are not as effective as sandbags. On these, you want to watch the upside as it collects dirt and debris, while the downside will erode. The sandbags are small impermeable walls laid and compacted and staggered. These need to be replaced by the 2nd year. Remember the issue regarding compaction and porosity and air pockets for the roots and the bugs. Minimize traffic. Activity, whether foot traffic or machinery, erodes the soil bonds, whether they're on a slope or on the flatland. Native Plant Society, in their book, Emerging from the Ashes, recommends bringing back the cows, goats, sheep, and if they've been on your land, bring them back. It's okay. What they're going to be doing with their little feet is nothing like what we do. Professional on-site fire damage. I wrote these all out because some of the people who are recovering from campfire might want to have more resources. The next section, as we leave short-term recommendations, addresses slopes on the property. Slopes and erosion maintenance. The goal, as you well know by now, is diverting and depowering the runoff. In Doug Kent's firescaping book, he addresses many factors more than we have time for, but we wanted to be sure to provide this formula to you. So on your own time, and I'm not a math genius here, that's why I took a picture of it instead of trying to explain it. But remember, this is when you want to be working with your neighbors and their property and how it affects yours. The hydrophobic layer that I talked about earlier can change what they call the hydrologic flow along a hillside. This reduces the rate of water of infiltration going down into the soil, and therefore increases the runoff probability, because that little layer that is at the top can also create kind of like an avalanche. And then all of a sudden, the right circumstances and the topsoil takes off. Moving on, the goal for building the soil structure and retaining the nutrients is looking at those pockets of air that are in the soil. Maybe those are from worms, maybe they're from bugs that have been eating and producing poo, compost, for feeding those roots. Some interventions on the slopes is depowering the runoff, both mechanically and horticulturally. So I'm going to go into details on these. The fiber rolls are filled with straw, rice hulls, or coconut waste, bound by strong plastic mesh. These screen the debris and the sediment, and they slow the low to medium flows of runoff. The maintenance is that they degrade within 1 to 2 years, and you want to be sure to remove that plastic mesh. On micro basins, small depressions dug into the slope. These are on flat to medium steep slopes. They slow down that runoff and increase infiltration. And their maintenance every 1 to 3 years is regrading as they fill with dirt and debris. Organic matting lays over the soil like jute matting. The erosion control and low to medium slopes that are at risk of topsoil loss. It holds the topsoil, it slows the runoff, and increases the infiltration and encourages revegetation. The maintenance is within 2 years. Terracing, as you see here, breaks up the length of the slope. It slows the topsoil loss and depowers the runoff. It increases infiltration of the water, and it's low maintenance. Every 2 to 3 years, the soil will be pulled back up to the wall, compacted or planted to stabilize the soil and footing. And this is where you want to use cover crops, because it's those roots that are going to stabilize the soil. Extreme measures. Sadly, with Camp Fire, there are some areas that do need more resources. And this gentleman, professionals like them or females, are certified in being able to address the more specifics. They work with chain link matting, and which works well with seeding. They also use plastic sheeting, which is anchored with sandbags and stakes, and they are able to calculate the soil loss. More permanent ways of diverting runoff is addressing slopes and hills. The goals are to slow the spread and sink the water, reduce erosion, increase the planting area, and create microclimates. Techniques and devices include concrete ditches along the face of a slope and catching the sheeting water. These are vital on steep slopes. On dry creeks, there are large ditches that are lined with rock. And swales, ditches that have been planted. They trench about 8 to 12 inches deep. It's laid out on the contour of the land like a small pool area, and it spreads out the water and nourishes the roots, therefore holding more water in place. Now, leaving the heavy details, we move on to the final 2 factors for intervening: wind and watering. From there, we'll be followed by Candace, finishing up with important information on mulches and her great pictures. On wind, the effects and breaking it up with structures. Consider what types of structures might address the wind factor, like fences, arbors, outbuildings, hedges, and trees. Wind and water gain leverage and soil gets pushed around. The topsoil blows off. With fences and outbuildings, we create placements and microclimates. Watering. Native Plant Society states clearly that we live in a Mediterranean climate with warm months, May to June to mid-October. And as we know, it's getting later in the year. Cool to cold winters and types of trees that canopy breaks the rainfall and the wind. The recommendations include watering at times where you get a quarter of an inch of watering. It depends on the type of irrigation system that you're using. Watering intervals 10 to 14 days apart, depending upon where you live. Inland slopes may be 7 to 10 days. Native plants are better suited to our climate. After the first 2 years of regular watering, the roots are deep enough and they acclimate. The non-native plants, we want to observe them for distress. The edges of the leaves curling, getting crispy on the sides, but always keep in mind, like in vegetable gardens, some plants will show, like squash plants, will show distress that is just a normal part of their managing their water and within themselves throughout the day. So at midday, the leaves of squash plants kind of melt up and then they open back up as the day progresses. Assessment. Gardening is divided into low and moderate and high water use areas. Excuse me. Plants with the same general needs, you want to keep them together. That's called hydrozoning. And that's a great word to be able to look up to find more information about. You want to limit the high use of water on lawns and plants that require that. Moderate water use areas are used as transition areas between the high need watering areas and the low needs. Irrigation scheduling, watering less frequently, but more deeply. Watering to the root depth of your plants. Remember, it's the organic level on top, the topsoil, that's actually creating the ability for those roots to take up the water. Allow the roots to take the water. Shrubs are watered more deeply, but less frequently. Watering is 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. Drip irrigation around the plants are more accurate. You want shorter watering times with breaks in between. My schedule is several hours in between, especially if there are slopes on your property, because it allows the water to infiltrate down and then water again a couple of hours later. That's why we have such a wide window. And remember back to the horizons, if we have impervious soil areas, it will allow that water to be able to seep down. Shade patterns, plants require less water. The understory plants thrive in dry shade. Irrigation maintenance, routinely assess for broken sprinkler heads, uneven water coverage due to incorrect placement, the head is too high or too low, or as the season, I have to always watch this, as the season and the plants grow up, they start blocking off the watering patterns. So I have to move the water head. For those of us who like a lot of detail, which it's obvious I do, the length of sunlight hours for the solar radiation. The sun at the highest in our area is in June. And in September, the plants may be sizzling. Therefore, place the plants of higher water needs slightly to the north of the trees, where they stand a better chance of being shaded all summer long. Solar radiation is highest in our area in mid-July. Therefore, less water is needed thereafter. Gray water. It is legal in Butte County for landscaping plants only, not your vegetable plants. 30 to 50% of household water, you can recycle it, reuse the laundry and the bath water, and the ponds that need cleaning. Do not use, as it says on the slide, the kitchen water and the dishwater or the toilet water. Design. You can use berms, which are slightly raised areas, but they dry out more quickly. So you want to keep an eye on that and, plan that for your irrigation. The swales are shallow ditches with mild slopes planted with grass or plants that can be directly watered. To rain gardens or appropriate areas to absorb that collection of water, putting plants that really like a lot of water in those areas. It's a slight depression in the ground that collects the water, usually at the base of a slope or a downspout. In dry wells, the underground space that accepts the runoff allows it to disperse slowly into the groundwater. And finally, with the green roof, got a new roof, replace it with a green roof of plantings over an impermeable membrane. It reduces the runoff and lowers the heating and air conditioning bills. In conclusion, we talked about soil as a living entity, factors affecting soil erosion, the need for roots going through layers to stabilize the soil particles in place, what erosion is in its many forms, and how to restore the soil through stopping its movement, whether through water, wind, or compaction. These interventions can be creative and attractive. Now let's hear from Candace as she shares her work with mulches.
So I just want to let you know that I'm going to be talking about mulches and hopefully helping you to make wise decisions about which mulch to use, where to put it, and why you've made that choice. So let me do a screen share and we'll start. Okay. All right. So mulches is any material that covers the ground. And it's different than compost or soil amendments that might be actually dug into and incorporated into the soil. And mulches play an important part both in our natural landscapes, such as our forest floors, our woodland floors, a grass environment. They help by you think of all the leaf litter or branches, pine cones, pine needles, all those dead matter decay and feed those plants. They prevent compaction from raindrops, as well as animal footprints. They prevent erosion, and all this litter provides habitat for different wildlife. But I'm going to be talking mostly about residential landscape. Next, please. Thank you. So depending on what kind of mulch you might be using, it can benefit the landscape in a number of ways. It might reduce the water needs of plants by preventing evaporation from the soil. It can cool soil temperatures. It can keep out weeds, reduce weeds, because it's eliminating a lot of the light. It can reduce erosion and dust, just as Anne had told you about. As it decays, it can maintain or renew the soil organic matter and prevent soil compaction. Next, please. I'm going to be talking about organic mulches and inorganic mulches, and they each have their benefits and their place. So organic mulches come from nature. They could be pine needles, leaves, grass clippings, shredded bark, redwood bark, wood chips, coca shells, gorilla hair, straw, and even ground rubber, because it comes from the rubber tree, is considered organic. And organic mulches, next please. Thank you. Organic mulches function to improve the soil. And here we see some white material on some bark that was against the soil, but has been flipped up for us to see. And this is actually mycelium. You can think of it as roots of fungi. And it's beginning that rotting process. And it's going to be improving the soil structure and creating air spaces for water and air to get down to the plant root zones. And also this rotting process is going to add nutrients to the soil. The mulch itself, simply by the layering of it, will reduce weed growth. Again, it's eliminating light. It's going to lower the soil temperature, conserve water, and prevent compaction. It's going to help the plants thrive. Next. And because organic mulches are decaying and feeding the soil, it's necessary periodically, maybe every 2 or 4 years, to actually reapply it to get that functional depth of keeping the light out, suppressing weed growth, conserving the water. Next, please. Inorganic mulches, on the other hand, come from rock, and they could be gravel, decomposed granite, concrete, boulders. And their job is to prevent seed germination. If it's deep enough, it needs to be 2 or 3 inches deep. It can prevent compaction. It keeps dust down, prevents erosion or reduces erosion, but it provides no benefit to the soil structure or the nutrient content. It does nothing to really help the plant thrive. Next, please. Okay, in 2008, the University of Nevada and some surrounding communities that were very concerned about forest fires did a study of 8 different kinds of mulches. And they wanted to know what the flame height of these different ones were, the rate of spread of the fire, and the temperature that they burned. And they found out that size and shape and texture and the parent material all influenced the combustibility. Next, please. So the ground rubber actually was the worst. It ignited the most easily, and it burned very, very hot for a long time. Pine needles was the second most hazardous thing. Next, please. They looked at shredded cedar was the third most hazardous, but they looked at wood chips. And the large wood chips they found actually allowed too much airspace in between. And we know that oxygen is one of the ingredients to fire, so it just fueled the fire. And if the mulch layers were more than 2 inches deep, they tended just to smolder and not be obvious. And so firefighters might tend just to walk by, that pile and not extinguish it. And in their conclusion, the best choice for residential landscapes turned out to be medium-sized wood chips that were about 1 inch in diameter. And that might be pine bark nuggets or composted wood chips, but it was the size that was important. Next, please. So to give you an idea of what large chips meant, they're almost palm size. And on the other hand, the shredded bark, you could see that's just like adding kindling to a fire. Next, please. Thank you. So fine stringy mulches, your shredded bark, your gorilla hair, those things burn very easily as opposed to that medium-sized chunk of bark or wood chip. All right, next, please. So having an idea of mulches, whether that's organic or inorganic, I'd like to apply that to the defensible space zones that you've heard in earlier presentations. And to begin with, we're going to talk about that 0 to 5 foot ignition zone. And there you start at your house or any attached footprint, such as a deck, and you work outward. And in that zone, nothing combustible in this zone is recommended. And so it's a place for your rock and your gravel, your pavers, your concrete, decomposed granite. Next, please. And contrary to many of our teachings about landscaping, this area now is recommended to have no plants at all, nothing that's combustible. So even potted plants aren't recommended. They tend to, the plant might grow and actually touch the siding of the house. They may be too heavy for a fireman to move away from the house. And so the picture might be pretty with the bright green grass and the black lava rock, the chartreuse, low grasses that aren't touching the siding, but truly plants are not recommended at all. All right, next, please. So under mulch, people typically would use plastic sheeting, wood cloth, cardboard, newsletters, and the idea is that it keeps out the light to suppress the weed growth. Next, please. However, you need to consider that those things are all flammable, and you need to choose two between plastic or weed cloth. Plastic's not going to let water return to the soil. Eventually, it's going to break down over time, and you're going to see it on the surface, and it's going to blow around, be messy, let your grass, your weeds grow through it. And fabric cloth, on the other hand, does allow water to penetrate back to the soil. All right, next, please. In the 5 to 30 foot clean, lean, green zone, the goal is to create an area that does not necessarily transmit fire to the home. Here you want to use non-combustible materials to reduce the energy, change the direction and speed of approaching fires. It's a place for decomposed granite paths, stone walls, boulders, pavers, seating areas, all to provide functional visual interest. Also, next please, also in that area, you know, your use of your medium-sized wood chips to a depth of 2 inches. And remember, you need to pull that away from all of your plants because it can cause disease problems at the base of your plants. This is a place where islands of healthy vegetation, your native plants, your succulents, your well-spaced shrubs, ground covers, limbed up small trees. They're very appropriate here. But remember that the plants need to be well watered to maintain. They can't have dead wood in them that needs to be pruned out. And your lawn needs to be well watered and mowed to no more than 4 inches. Next, please. Here's some pretty pictures of hardscapes that can be effective fire breaks and be attractive. It's a place for pathways, driveways, decomposed granite, walkways, patios, masonry walls, water features. Next, please. And just like plant design, when you're thinking of using mulches, you can think in terms of contrast, color, texture, size. Here we have pavers that are going to let water go back into the soil, and they contrast to the rough boulders next to them. One picture has concrete sidewalk, but beside it, it has small gravelly rocks. The picture on the bottom left, you know, shows contrast between your brown mulches, your organic mulch, your bigger boulders, your gray contrasting color creek bed, and small red lava rock, lastly. Next, please. So contrast can add interest. On the left, you see black lava, you see the salt and pepper gravel, you see red toned, bigger sized gravel, well-spaced plants. And on the right, this was actually in a 0 to 5 foot zone. Instead of using these flat black rocks just stacked up, they vertically set them to create the effect of a current. And they contrasted that with boulders and your red tone. And they do have small alyssum that wouldn't be recommended to be in that 5 foot zone, but it's not It's not going to have dead woodies, it's just going to dry up and wither if it gets too hot. Next, please. So just reminding you that it's okay to be creative. The picture on the left, it doesn't represent our area very well, but it does show an example of wide inorganic mulch, the use of boulders to redirect fire. The plants are well maintained, that you don't see dead branches that need pruning out. And on the right, again, are those black flat rocks that are set vertically. This was probably a 15-foot area to create a sense of current. And then on each side, we're planting islands. Next, please. So as we move further out to the 30 and 100-foot reduced fire zone, our goal here is to create breaks in the fuels that will decrease the energy and the speed of an approaching fire. It's an area where you can have, green lawn, brown organic mulch, islands with plants in them, inorganic mulch or mulches for contrast. In this area, you want open spaces between your shrubs and trees. It's a place where you can do swales, you can have green grass that slopes down, and maybe have rocks that are inorganic, non-combustible, but it also allows your rainwater and irrigation water to slowly return to the soil in your own property. It's a place that you can have your islands and your plant groupings that need the same kind of water zones. And as you move further out and you maybe are approaching that wildland urban interface, I want to remind you that any surface litter, those natural leaves that fall, the pine needles should not be more than 3 feet deep. And that might keep a slow ground fire. That's a natural process without it getting up into your shrubs and your crowns of your trees. So next, please. Thank you. So again, in this 30 to 100 feet, our goal is to reduce the fire ladder, to have open spaces between your green islands. You can have green lawn, you can have organic or inorganic mulches. You can use your decomposed granite or broken concrete. Between the shrubs, you can use organic or inorganic mulches. And the last one doesn't relate to mulches, but it's a reminder that between your lowest tree limbs and shrubs, you need open space. You want to avoid that fire ladder. Next, please. So this is an area where you want to slow the burn. You can do that with inorganic material, different mulches. Boulders are redirecting. The picture on the right is a slope, and so they've handled that by doing rock walls that are going to terrace that slope for erosion. It's also going to redirect that fire. Next, please. So in summing up, we talked about organic, inorganic mulches, and both have some beneficial functions. They prevent, they slow, they redirect approaching fires, and you get to choose what and where to use them. And I'd really encourage you as you travel around town to notice changes that folks are doing in their grassy front yards as they convert them to water-wise and fire-wise landscapings. And in particular, that 0 to 5 foot zone where there's nothing combustible, people are getting very, very creative and artistic with that area. So you've got lots of models just around our own town. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for your interest in educating yourself about fire-wise landscaping. And Ann and I will be happy to take questions. Also, I'd like to remind you that next week, April 20th, Cheryl Kozad is going to help you see a new vision to modify your garden for fire-safe designed. And she's going to be talking about landscaping by zone, assessing what to keep, cut, or move. And you'll see ways to add function and interest to your landscape as you increase fire safety. So thank you all, and we'll look forward to your questions.